Chapter 5, Camp Eagle. Camp Eagle, Sarajevo, January 1997. The transport plane's engines whined as it descended, its massive body shuddering against the cold Balkan air. The deep hum of the C-130 Hercules had long since become a background noise, but as the aircraft tilted slightly on approach, Shane felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. He wasn't alone. Around him, the rest of the unit sat in silence, bracing themselves for what lay ahead. Through the small porthole windows, the snow-covered mountains stretched out beneath them, jagged and vast, swallowing everything in their presence. The land below was a patchwork of white and gray, a ghostly landscape of skeletal trees, abandoned villages, and narrow, winding roads that cut through the hills like scars. From up here, it was easy to imagine Bosnia as just another winter-struck country, but even at this altitude, the war's presence was unmistakable. Burned-out buildings, craters where homes had once stood, and the faint, eerie remnants of trenches and fortifications that now sat empty. A jolt ran through the plane as it hit the tarmac. Shane gripped his rucksack tighter, fingers digging into the fabric. The ramp lowered, and the cold rushed in like a living thing, slicing through the lingering warmth of the aircraft's interior. "All right, move," the sergeant's voice rang out. Boots hit the steel ramp in rapid succession, the unit filing out into the open. The first breath Shane took was sharp and dry, the air heavy with the scent of burning wood and fuel. Camp Eagle sat sprawled out before them, a mix of prefabricated barracks, towering floodlights, and rows of sandbagged fortifications. Some buildings were simple metal frame structures with tarped roofs. Others were sturdier, converted warehouses and old barracks left behind by previous forces. Razor wire snaked along the perimeter, and in the distance, armored vehicles sat parked in neat formations, their dark green bodies standing in contrast to the white ground. The base itself felt like a strange halfway point between order and chaos. Some parts were neat, almost clinical, rows of tents, Quonset huts, and storage containers lined up with military precision. Others bore the weight of recent occupation, hastily assembled bunkers, makeshift guard towers, and walls riddled with bullet holes. Signs written in both English and Serbo-Croatian were posted around. Danger, mines, authorized personnel only, no photography. The mountains loomed in the background, steep and watchful. Shane had read about the geography of Bosnia before deployment, but seeing it now standing beneath those peaks, he understood why the war had been so brutal. This was a sniper's paradise. They moved toward the central processing area, boots crunching over ice-packed gravel. Soldiers milled about in groups, some lugging gear, others warming their hands over metal barrels filled with burning scrap wood. A few locals in civilian clothing, contractors, translators, hurried between buildings with their heads down, eyes wary. "Welcome to the vacation resort," one of the older soldiers muttered, adjusting his pack. Someone snorted. "Yeah, real fucking cozy." Shane exhaled, watching his breath cloud in the air. Inside one of the warehouses, the air was warmer but carried a heavy, oily scent. Gunmetal, grease, and the faint bite of burnt powder. Rows of tables stretched across the space, each covered in meticulously laid-out weapons, ammunition cases, and stacks of paperwork. The line moved quickly. Soldiers stepped forward, received their assigned weapons, and moved aside to check them over. Shane stood with his hands shoved into his pockets, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness. He already knew what he was supposed to get. An M16A2 rifle, same as he'd trained with, same as the one he'd carried stateside. The routine was familiar, expected. Then his name was called. He stepped forward, signing the form, then reached out instinctively for the weapon the armorer slid across the table. His fingers hesitated as he looked down. It wasn't an M16. Instead, the weapon was larger, bulkier, A long perforated barrel extended out in front, ending in a thick flash suppressor. The body was matte black with thick polymer grips, and a long belt of disintegrating link ammunition sat coiled beside it like a sleeping snake. The M249 squad automatic weapon, the SAW. Shane blinked, a cold weight settling in his stomach. "You sure?" he asked, looking up. The armorer, a stocky sergeant with a clipboard, barely glanced at him. "That's what's assigned to you." Shane ran a hand over the receiver, feeling the weight of it. He knew the M249. He'd seen it, handled it during training, even fired it a few times. But he wasn't trained to carry it. He wasn't supposed to be the guy running a light machine gun in the field. "Thought I was getting an M16, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Things change." The sergeant shrugged. "Congratulations, you're the saw gunner now." Shane exhaled slowly. The M249 was a beast, 22 pounds unloaded, nearly 30 with a full drum. It could spit out 5.56 rounds at almost 800 rounds per minute, and while that made it a hell of a weapon for suppressing fire, it also meant he'd be lugging a heavy son of a bitch through the mountains, up and down icy roads, through God knows what terrain. And worst of all, he wasn't confident with it. He picked it up, feeling the weight settle across his arms. The balance was different, heavier toward the front. The collapsible bipod folded neatly beneath the barrel, but even without it deployed, the gun felt long and unwieldy compared to an M16. His fingers curled around the pistol grip as he brought it up slightly, feeling the unfamiliar heft in his hands. Someone clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Sucks, doesn't it?" Shane turned to see one of the other guys grinning at him, a corporal with a scar running down the side of his jaw. "You get used to it," the corporal said, "or you don't." Shane forced a smirk. "Encouraging?" The corporal chuckled. "Just don't forget to keep the fucking bolt clean, or you'll be carrying a 30-pound paperweight." Shane nodded absently, but his mind was already racing. He needed to practice, needed to get comfortable fast. Because if things went sideways out here, he'd be the one laying down covering fire for his unit, and the last thing he wanted was to be the weak link. He stepped aside, moving to a quieter corner of the warehouse. He set the weapon down, popped open the feed tray, and ran his fingers over the metal, checking for any rough spots or fouling. The belt-fed system was different from the magazines he was used to, and he reminded himself to keep an eye on the links. One jam at the wrong time could mean the difference between covering his squad or leaving them exposed. As he worked, a few other soldiers passed by, some shooting him looks of sympathy, others amusement. Lauren strolled up last, hands stuffed into his pockets, smirking like he just won a bet. "They gave your scrawny ass a saw?" he asked, grinning. Shane didn't look up. "Shut the hell up, Tay." Lauren chuckled, leaning against a crate. "Hey, I'm just saying. I'd have thought they'd give you something lighter, like maybe a sharp stick." Shane huffed, shaking his head. "You see what you got yet?" Lauren pulled his own weapon up slightly, a standard M16A2. "Got exactly what I wanted. Can't all be so lucky, huh?" Shane shot him a dry look before turning back to his weapon. He ran his fingers over the sights, checking alignment, getting a feel for the grip, the trigger. The weight of it was still foreign, still wrong, but he didn't have a choice. Lauren watched him for a moment, then smirked. "You brought extra socks, right?" "You asked when we were leaving," Shane snorted, finally cracking a small grin. "Yeah, figured I'd need 'em." "I know, just being helpful," Lauren nodded approvingly. "Good. Can't have you bitching about cold feet while you're getting us all killed." "You've said that before too, you dickwad." Shane exhaled, looking down at the M249 one last time. He still wasn't sure about it, still felt the doubt pressing against his ribs. But he'd figure it out. He had to. The morning air hung heavy the very next day. Its cold, damp chill settled into the bones of every soldier gathered at the makeshift range outside Camp Eagle. A low ceiling of gray clouds pressed down on the valley, threatening snow, but for now the air remained dry. Shane stood near the firing line, his breath curling in the frigid air as he adjusted his gloves, shifting his grip on the M249's polymer handguard. The weapon still felt unnatural in his hands, heavier and more unwieldy than the M16 he'd trained on. His fingers instinctively searched for the comfort of a standard rifle grip, but there was none. The SAW was a different beast entirely, designed not for precision but for sustained firepower, laying down rounds in bursts meant to suppress and dominate. Across from him, Staff Sergeant Stephen Laughlin watched with the same unreadable expression he always wore, arms crossed over his plate carrier. At 34, Laughlin had been through multiple deployments, his face lined with the kind of experience that only came from years spent in the field. He wasn't the kind to hand out praise, nor was he one to ignore weaknesses. Right now, Shane was the weak link. "All right, Alexander," Laughlin finally spoke, his voice even, unhurried. "Show me what you've learned." Shane nodded, dropping to one knee as he moved through the steps. His mind went into checklist mode, ticking off each action like a drill instructor was screaming over his shoulder. Step 1, conduct a function check. With practiced movements, he locked the charging handle to the rear, feeling the weight of the bolt slide back against its spring tension. He visually inspected the chamber. Clear. He released the bolt and dry-fired once, listening for the crisp metallic snap of the firing pin releasing. No sluggishness, no stick in the trigger pull. Laughlin gave a small nod. "All right, load up." Shane grabbed a belt of 5.56 millimeter linked rounds, the brass casings catching what little light broke through the clouds. He placed them carefully onto the feed tray, ensuring the lead round sat properly in the groove before closing the feed cover with a firm clack. Step 2, confirm the seating. He racked the charging handle back, letting the bolt strip the first round into the chamber. Then, taking a breath, he settled into firing position. Step 3, find stability. Shane flattened his body against the frozen ground, elbows digging into the packed dirt as he adjusted his grip. The SAW's bipod, already deployed, pressed firmly into the earth, giving the weapon much-needed stability. He widened his stance slightly, feet angled outward to absorb the recoil, just as the training manuals had instructed. "You're sitting too high," Laughlin said coolly. "Get that stock deep into your shoulder. You're firing a light machine gun, not a goddamn hunting rifle." Shane gritted his teeth and adjusted, pulling the stock tighter against his shoulder pocket. He could already feel the strain building in his arms from controlling the front-heavy weapon, but he ignored it. Step 4, sight alignment and trigger control. The iron sights were simple but effective, a standard peep sight and post. Shane centered the target, a silhouette cutout sitting 100 meters downrange, and settled his breathing. "Short bursts," Laughlin reminded him. 3 to 5 rounds, keep control." Shane pressed the trigger, and the M249 bucked against his shoulder with rapid mechanical violence. The burst was over in an instant, a sharp rat-tat-tat cutting through the cold air. The muzzle climbed slightly, but the bipod kept it from veering wildly off course. He paused, corrected, and fired another burst. Brass casings clattered against the ground beside him. The spent links, now just empty skeletons of the belt, spilled from the side of the receiver. "Not bad," Laughlin muttered. Again. Shane continued, working through several more bursts, adjusting his posture between each. His shoulder burned from the repeated impact, but he pushed through, focusing on keeping the weapon steady. By the time the belt ran dry, his fingers were stiff from the cold and his muscles ached from holding the weapon in place. He sat up, exhaling hard. Laughlin crouched beside him, eyes scanning the target through his binoculars. "You're grouping a little wide, but it's manageable. Your first shots are on target, but you're losing control on the tail end of each burst. That's your grip. Shane nodded, shaking feeling back into his fingers. Yeah, feels like I'm fighting the weight every time. You are. Laughlin sat back on his heels. It's front heavy. You've got to counterbalance it with your stance. Keep that bipod locked in. Don't muscle the gun. Let it work for you. Shane wiped the sweat from his brow despite the cold. I'll keep working on it. You better. Laughlin's tone was firm but not unkind. He stood and nodded toward the weapon. All right, clear it and reload. We're running another belt. Shane sighed but didn't argue. He went through the clearing drill with precision, pulling back the charging handle, opening the feed tray, confirming the chamber was empty, and then dry firing one last time before moving to reload. It was going to be something he'd have to work on over the span of a few days at least. The perimeter of the base was lined with razor wire guard towers cutting stark silhouettes against the gray sky. The place was functional, built for utility, not comfort. Snow had crusted over the roads, turning to slush where boots and heavy vehicles churned through it. The air smelled of diesel, damp earth, and the lingering scent of burning wood from the makeshift fire pit scattered across the camp. Shane Alexander kept to himself. He wasn't rude about it, never dismissive, never outright ignoring anyone, but he wasn't the kind of guy to strike up casual conversation. He answered when spoken to, nodded when necessary, and kept his head down. If it weren't for Lauren, he might have seemed downright unapproachable. Lauren, on the other hand, talked to damn near everyone. The guy had a way of slipping into conversations like he'd always been part of them, grinning, cracking jokes, making small talk with a mix of genuine curiosity and effortless ease. When they ate in the mess tent, Lauren drifted between tables, catching up on stories, learning names, soaking up the camaraderie like it fueled him. Shane sat with him, but he always waited until the moment was right. Until Lauren settled back in next to him, a little quieter, a little less surrounded, before he spoke. Man, you ain't gotta be so sneaky about talking to me, Lauren teased one night, stirring a steaming cup of instant coffee. It ain't like folks are gonna bite you. Shane smirked. I like to pick my moments. Lauren laughed, shaking his head. You're something else, bud. At night, or even after the rotations had ended when the cold had settled in deep and there wasn't much else to do, the guys who'd been in Bosnia longer would sit around in clusters, swapping stories, passing the time. Shane never joined in, but he listened. He always listened. The ones who'd been there for months, some since the first NATO forces rolled in, spoke of Bosnia with the kind of hardened bluntness that came from seeing too much. This place ain't like Iraq or Afghanistan, said Staff Sergeant Walker, a stocky, no-bullshit Texan who spoke as every word cost him effort. You ain't fighting nobody. You're just stuck here watching people who still hate each other pretend to play nice. Corporal Hayes, a wiry guy with a permanent scowl, nodded. Yeah, 'cause they have to. If we weren't here, shit, they'd be right back at it. You go out there past the checkpoints and you see it, the way they look at each other like they're just waiting. They talked about the local population, how some of them were grateful but plenty weren't. How the war might have been officially over, but it sure as hell didn't feel like it. Had this old man come up to me last week, said Private Medina, rubbing his gloved hands together. Kept thanking me in broken English, said his whole family got killed back in '92. Just him left now. Guy was shaking so bad. I thought he was gonna pass out right there. Hayes scoffed. Yeah, but then you get the ones who spit at the ground when you walk past. Ain't no love lost here. Some of 'em lost everything, some of 'em lost power, and some just lost the war. All they see is us keeping 'em from finishing what they started. Walker let out a low breath, nodding. We ain't heroes to everybody, that's for damn sure. And then there were the landmines. That was the thing that made Shane's stomach twist when they talked about it. The sheer, ever-present danger of what lay hidden beneath the soil. Had a kid lose his damn leg last month, said Specialist Devers, shaking his head. Little Bosnian boy couldn't have been older than 10. Stepped off the road to pick up something and he made a quick, sharp motion with his hands, mimicking an explosion. Gone. Just like that. You see the way his mama screamed, you don't forget that shit. There were nods all around. No one had anything to add to that. Shane stared at the fire, absorbing every word, letting it sink deep. He never showed it, never let anything cross his face, but it stayed with him, settling in the back of his mind like a weight he hadn't figured out how to carry yet. Not all the stories were bleak, though. Some were ridiculous, stupid in the way only soldiers could appreciate. Walker, who had been leaning back against a crate, took a long sip of his coffee and let out a grunt. You know, I got a buddy back in Houston, an old boy named Jimmy, did a tour in Iraq a few years back, lost a damn leg, came home, brought himself a wife. Lauren raised a brow. Brought? Walker smirked. Yeah, man. Met her there. One of them Iraqi girls. Swear to God. Said, fuck it, I need someone to take care of my ass. And 2 months later, she's there in his house cooking breakfast like she's been there her whole damn life. There were chuckles around the circle. No shit, Medina said, and that worked out for him? Hell yeah, it did, Walker drawled, shaking his head. Man's happier than a pig in shit. Ain't gotta do a damn thing. She handles the house, the bills, even fixes his prosthetic when something goes wrong. Says losing that leg was the best thing that ever happened to him. Lauren was grinning. Damn, maybe I ought to step on a mine then. Walker let out a barking laugh. Shit, son, if you did, you probably just end up with a hospital bill and a lifetime of regrets. Jimmy just got lucky. The mood lifted for a moment, the shared amusement a brief reprieve from the heavier conversations of the night. But as the laughter faded, the silence that followed carried the same weight as before. Still, Walker mused, staring into the fire. He's got a simple life now. Ain't much, but it's his. Bet he sleeps a hell of a lot better than we do. No one disagreed with that. Shane never jumped into these talks, never offered up his own thoughts or stories. But he was there. He listened. He watched how the older guys spoke, the way their eyes flickered between humor and something heavier, something more settled. They weren't broken, not by any means, but there was a part of them that seemed resigned to what they were doing here, like they'd expected something different, something simpler, and ended up with this. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret, it was just reality, and Shane sat with it, letting it muddle deep in his gut. He wasn't sure what kind of soldier he'd be by the time he left this place. He only knew he wouldn't be the same one who had arrived. Afterward, that same evening, after the rest of the squad had finished their training rotations, Shane remained at the range. The sun had set, and the temperature had plummeted even further, but he wasn't leaving until he was sure he could operate the M249 without hesitation. Laughlin, to his credit, had stuck around. Though he didn't say it outright, Shane suspected the squad leader was keeping an eye on him, making sure he didn't burn himself out or make mistakes in exhaustion. This time, Shane worked through different malfunction drills. Failure to fire. He simulated a misfire, waiting for the mandatory seconds before clearing the round. Pull the charging handle back, observe the chamber, release, fire. Failure to feed. A jammed belt was trickier. He had to manually pull the links out, reseat them, and rack the charging handle again. Failure to extract. If a spent casing got stuck, he practiced manually clearing it with a knife tip, keeping his hands away from the chamber. By the time he worked through the last cycle, his fingers were raw from handling cold metal, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing he was getting faster, smoother. Laughlin finally nodded, seemingly satisfied. Not bad, Alexander. Shane exhaled, feeling the cold settle into his bones. Appreciate it, Sergeant. Laughlin glanced around, then lowered his voice. Look, I get it. You didn't sign up to be a SAW gunner, but the squad needs one, and right now, that's you. So you learn this weapon inside and out. Make it second nature. If you hesitate in the field, you're not just screwing yourself, you're screwing everyone. Shane met his gaze. I won't hesitate. Laughlin studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good. Now pack it up. We've got an early start tomorrow. Shane shouldered the heavy weapon, feeling its weight settle against him. It still didn't feel all that natural, but it was getting there. A week later, they were given the instructions for which they'd traveled an ocean for. The night was cold, but everyone already knew that. It wasn't new. Sergeant John Fitzpatrick stood tall near the edge of the campfire circle. His posture was straight, the flicker of the flames reflecting in his hard eyes. He was a man who didn't speak much, but when he did, everyone listened. His salt and pepper hair and the rough lines of his face told stories of battles fought, how years spent in the military had worn him down but never broken him, someone who'd sunk, yet never sank. All right, listen up. Fitzpatrick's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, pulling everyone's attention like a magnet. The night grew quieter, the usual background chatter falling away as the soldiers turned to face their platoon sergeant. We'll be receiving our first mission briefing tomorrow morning, 0800 sharp. You're gonna want to get a good night's rest and be ready to move out fast. This ain't some training exercise. This is the real deal. So, get your gear squared away and your heads right. Tomorrow could get interesting. The campfire crackled in the silence that followed. The men exchanged glances. For most, this was their first taste of real combat after months of training, and it was starting to feel more and more like the prelude to something they couldn't quite see coming. Shane stood a few feet away from the group, his focus locked on his new weapon, the M249, which he had spent hours getting to know over the past few days. The cold steel body of the machine gun rested across his knees as he knelt on the ground, a clean rag in one hand and a bottle of oil in the other. His hands moved over the weapon with something bordering obsession, making sure every moving part was free of dirt, dust, or debris. It wasn't that Shane was a perfectionist. He just knew that a clean weapon was the difference between life and death, especially when you were going to be carrying it into the unknown. Every click of the bolt, every twist of the cleaning rod was another step in his preparation for whatever lay ahead. The sound of Fitzpatrick's boots crunching in the snow brought Shane's attention back to the present. The platoon sergeant's silhouette was framed by the light of the fire, his face unreadable as he approached. Fitzpatrick didn't say anything at first. He just watched Shane clean the weapon, his eyes assessing, weighing. "You'll be all right with that thing?" Fitzpatrick finally asked, his voice low and steady. "I've been working with it the past week, sir." Shane was respectful, but the man could sense that he wasn't fully convinced of himself yet. "I'll get it right, Sergeant." Fitzpatrick grunted, the sound almost like approval. "Good. You've got a lot to learn about that weapon. Take it seriously. Don't let your guard down." Shane nodded, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what Fitzpatrick was getting at. The M249 had a rate of fire that could chew through a line of enemies in seconds, but if you weren't careful with it, it could turn on you just as quickly. The platoon sergeant turned to walk away, but not before he threw one last glance over his shoulder. "Get some sleep, Alexander. Tomorrow we start earning our pay." Shane didn't respond, but he wasn't offended. It was the kind of comment that didn't require a reply. Fitzpatrick was the kind of guy who said what he meant, and he'd already said more than enough for Shane to know where he stood. As the sounds of the camp grew quieter, Shane continued working on his weapon. The oil was smeared on the barrel, glinting faintly in the firelight. His hands were steady, almost mechanical, as he reassembled the M249 piece by piece. Each click and clank of the parts felt oddly reassuring, like the gun was becoming an extension of his own body. He didn't have time to be afraid of it. There was no room for fear when the stakes were this high. Once the weapon was clean and ready, Shane sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on the rag before tucking it into his pocket. He glanced over at the other soldiers, still gathered around the campfire. Lauren was talking animatedly with Walker, his voice loud and carefree as usual. Some of the others had already started to retreat to their tents, eager to get a little rest before the mission briefing in the morning. He stayed where he was, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and half-formed concerns. The sounds of his comrades' laughter and chatter seemed distant, even though they were only a few yards away. He was mentally preparing for whatever lay ahead, running through scenarios in his head. The usual, what if I fuck up and get myself killed? Kind of standard questions. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Lauren's voice calling his name. Shane didn't respond at first, but he could feel Lauren's eyes on him. He looked up briefly, meeting Lauren's gaze. "What?" Shane called. Lauren grinned, the firelight dancing on his face. "You gonna just sit there all night, or are you gonna get some sleep like the rest of us?" Shane gave him a small, tight smile. "I'm good. Just got some things to think about." Lauren's smile faded a little, but he didn't press. "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me." He gave Shane a brief nod and wandered off toward his tent. Shane watched him go, then turned his focus back to the rifle in his hands. His mind was already on the briefing tomorrow, on the mission ahead, on everything that could go wrong and everything that might go right. The night stretched on, the cold creeping deeper, but Shane didn't move. He was ready in his own way. Whatever came next, he would face it head on, just like he always had. After a while, he stood up, stretched his stiff legs, and made his way to his tent. The sounds of the camp faded behind him, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of his own breathing. He crawled into his sleeping bag, his mind still racing with thoughts of the mission and the weapon by his side. But somewhere in the back of his mind there was a quiet voice telling him that tomorrow would be the start of something far bigger than any of them had prepared for. And whatever it was, Shane knew that he was ready, knew that he was ready, knew that he was ready.